Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. This is our sixth Lege and Learn session, and we're really excited to have Vice Chairman Brooks Landgraff here from the House Transportation Committee. We really hope that you're enjoying these sessions. We have several more lined up next week. Next Tuesday at 9 a.m. we have Mondo Martinez, who is another member of the House Transportation Committee. And a champion of transportation issues in the House. And we also have next Thursday at 2 p.m. Celia Israel, who is another champion of transportation in the House. And that's going to be next Thursday at 2 p.m. So look for those notices that'll be coming out. You'll notice that we've used the hashtag TXLEGE in all of our communications. We encourage you to use that and follow those conversations as we head towards session. I want to thank our series sponsors. We have Costello Engineering, Outreach Strategists, the Lentz Group, Half Associates, LAN, LJA Engineering, and Memorial Herman. So thank you so much to our series sponsors. I do want to invite anyone to ask questions. If you can use the chat box to message me directly with your name, affiliation, and your question. And if you want to ask the question, or if you would like me to ask the question for you, and please send those throughout the program, and we'll try to get as many answered as possible. Without further ado, I would like to go ahead and introduce Vice Chairman Brooks Landgraff. He comes to us, as I said, from the House Transportation Committee. He is the Vice Chairman. He's been serving in the House since 2015. He is born native Odessa, Texas, and represents his fellow West Texans in Andrews, Ector, Ward, and Winkler counties. He is a fifth generation rancher. So I think that's a great perspective that he brings to the transportation conversation, kind of that more rural viewpoint. And he is an Aggie. So for all those that want to whoop right now, please do. And I think this is really cool. He's an Eagle Scout. So as a former Scout myself, I always have a lot of respect. I know how hard that achievement is, and it automatically says a lot about a person. So he also serves on the House Business and Industry Committee, and the House Select Committee on Mass Violence Prevention and Community Safety. And in 2019, he was appointed to the Texas Commission on Judicial Selection. And that's just a snapshot of all of his achievements. So without any more delay, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our Vice Chairman of House Transportation. And he is remote today and concerned a little bit about bandwidth. So I feel like maybe it's a good, Vice Chairman, maybe it's a good topic to bring up, since I know you're a huge proponent of expanding broadband. So I know you're remote, and so we're not going to see his live face, but we'll see a lovely picture while he speaks. So take it away, sir.
Okay, Andrea, thank you very much. And it's good to be with all of you today, and certainly I appreciate the invitation from TAG. In addition to that, I also want to express the appreciation that I have for all of you, for the sponsors, for being so dedicated to improving infrastructure, not only in the greater Houston area, but also across Texas. And I think this Lege and Learn series, by the way, is fantastic, especially in light of the pandemic and all of the changes that have had to take place. It's allowing so many of these important conversations to move forward. And I know that as a legislator, there's no stop, there's no rest. All of our work has to continue. And of course, the work that we do, it's optimized when we have as much public involvement as possible. And so I've really welcomed the opportunity to have this feedback with you. And I know that you've had so many great speakers over the past few weeks. And I know just a couple of my colleagues who are coming up here in the very near future are also great additions to that conversation. So thank you for taking the time to do all this. It is very much appreciated. Now, speaking of the pandemic and changes that are going on, I'm sure you've heard and probably heard Senator Hancock mention this earlier this week, but the Texas legislature will be convening back into session in January of 2021. So we're just a few months away. And of course, there are some questions about how that's actually going to look. But we're moving forward with all of the plans that are going to be necessary to have an effective legislative session. And Andrea, that's a good point about broadband. I will mention that a little bit later in my remarks. But what I would like to do is just give you an overview of some of the things that were accomplished in the last session, especially as that lines up with so many of the issues that TAG is acutely concerned with, and that I think that I and so many of my colleagues are concerned with, and then also about what work is being done right now, what conversations are taking place right now in preparation for the legislative session that's going to begin in January. So, but I'm going to try to keep those remarks as brief as possible, because I would like to spend as much time as we have available answering questions from the group. So if that's okay with everybody, I'll move forward in that manner. But I think the one thing that I really want to discuss as far as this overview here at the top really has to do with what we call the transportation funding pie, and how we're always needing to make that funding source, or those sources, that blending of sources, as big as possible, because as we all know, the transportation needs and the infrastructure needs all across the state of Texas continue to grow as our economy grows, as our population grows, and as our communities grow. And so we have to be very creative with the ways that we're doing that. And I know that the team at TAG is also, I love the phrase when you're talking about having all of the tools available in the toolbox for transportation infrastructure funding and maintenance. And I think that's absolutely critical as well. And so that pie and that toolbox, in my view, go hand in hand. And we have to do everything that we can to cultivate those and make them work for the people of Texas. So along those lines, let me just talk briefly about what's been done, specifically in regard to the last session, and maybe just some small examples about how we are providing these tools, about how we're increasing the size of that pie, and how we need to continue along that theme. Now, some of these are big, some of them are a little bit smaller, but I think that's the approach that we have to take. We have to look at every available option, every available resource when it comes to funding our transportation infrastructure. I do like mentioning this, and it might be a slightly bigger deal out in the Permian Basin where I'm from, relative to some of the metro areas, but I do think it's important all across the state. But during the last legislative session, I introduced a bill, and thankfully we were able to get it passed. It was HB 799. The number's not really that important, but basically what it was a bridge strike bill. And more accurately, it's an overpass strike bill. And the way that I like to summarize it is it basically creates in-state law when it comes to overheight commercial motor vehicles. If you strike an overpass, you break it, you buy it rule applies. And so what this does is it creates a Class B misdemeanor offense for the operation of a vehicle without the appropriate or applicable licenses or permits, if that strike results in damage to a bridge or an underpass because of the height of the vehicle. So basically what this does is it holds the owner of the vehicle or the driver strictly liable for the cost of any damages. Now, the reason why that's important, the reason why I'm bringing that up in this discussion, is that one reason why we wanted to do that is, I mean, first of all, it's just the right thing to do. It's right to hold the wrongdoer accountable for actions that result in damage like that. But secondly, as these bridge strikes became a more common occurrence out in the oil patch with overheight commercial vehicles, more and more money from a transportation budget was having to go to these unscheduled, unanticipated repairs. And as we know, for even the smallest overpass, sometimes that can be a $25 million price tag. And when that's an unexpected occurrence, which these strikes are, it's not routine maintenance or, at the end of an overpass's useful life, then that $25 million, just as an example, has to come elsewhere out of a transportation budget. And so that means that money is just going back to rebuild what we already had, rather than going toward expansion of our infrastructure. And I saw that was really beginning to take a toll on some of our funding mechanisms. And so rather than force the taxpayers or the users to bear those costs, why don't we make sure that the responsible party covers those costs so that we can put our money to its highest use. So I'm very proud of that legislation, very proud that it's the law of Texas now, and it's already beginning to have an impact that we've seen so far since it took effect about a year ago. But that's the type of mentality I believe that we have to bring to the transportation funding equation. And kind of along those lines, let me tell you about one thing that we worked on that didn't pass, but something that we're going to continue to pursue. And this definitely falls in the category of increasing the size of that pie. It's something called the Grow Texas Fund. And this is something that Speaker Tom Craddock, or former Speaker Tom Craddock, and I worked on. But let me just break it down very simply. What it does is it takes a portion of oil and gas severance taxes that would otherwise go to the state's rainy day fund, and it would dedicate them to transportation projects and some other critical needs, but mainly transportation projects in the state's energy sector. Now, it's not just the energy sector, when you think of the oil patch, but we had very specific provisions in this proposal during the last session that, for example, would have provided funding for port infrastructure and port authorities, in places like Houston and navigation districts there on the Gulf Coast that are engaged in exporting oil and gas or importing or refining or other downstream aspects of the oil and gas industry. But the idea is that we reinvest a portion of those oil and gas production taxes and put it into the transportation infrastructure in areas of the state like Houston, like the Permian Basin, like the Barnett Shale, like the Eagle Ford Shale, that are critical to energy production, which, as we know, although we are an increasingly economic diverse state, energy production is still a huge part of who we are. And if we don't take care of infrastructure in those areas, then we're, in a certain sense, killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And that's something that we are desperately trying to avoid. And so, because this is a heavy lift, as you might imagine, it actually requires two pieces of legislation and then would ultimately require voter approval in the form of a constitutional amendment. And we were able to get quite a bit of the way there. But because this is a relatively new concept, it's going to take some time to get everybody on board that we need. But we did have quite a few successful votes in the House, and actually had some great co-authors from the Houston area. My colleagues, Rep. Tom Oliverson comes to mind, also Representative Marianne Perez, both of whom are from Harris County. And anyway, we had a lot of success, actually a lot of unexpected success there. But we're going to continue up that fight when the legislature reconvenes in January. But I think those are some very good developments. But while I'm on the toolbox theme, let me just say, these are issues that come up on the transportation committee. And as Andrea mentioned, that's the committee that I'm currently the vice chairman of. And as our infrastructure needs continue to grow, but we have stagnant revenue in some ways, while we're trying to find new sources of revenue, whether it's through the Grow Texas Fund or whether it's through personal liability for damages to highway infrastructure, there are other tools that have historically been in the box that have been limited a little bit. And of course, toll roads come to mind. And I think those are tools that absolutely can serve the interest of the people of Texas and can be a tremendously helpful way to make sure that our transportation infrastructure needs are being met. And that's a classic example of ways to expand that pie. Now, I know that there's been quite a bit of negativity about being in a toll road environment, and maybe there's an argument to be made that we went overboard, in years past. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but I think going as long as we have without having any sort of emphasis on the benefits that can be provided by toll roads, I think that is catching up with us, and I think it is increasingly becoming more and more a part of the conversation. And I think it will continue to be and I think it always is helpful to keep the public involved in those conversations, to keep voters involved in those conversations. And so I think if we move forward in that way, we can utilize those to their full potential. But the more that we can do that, the bigger that pie gets, and the easier and more efficiently we can address some of these really big but really necessary transportation infrastructure projects, particularly in high volume traffic areas in our major metropolitan areas. So those are opportunities that I know I'm going to be looking for in the upcoming session, but I know that I have quite a few other colleagues, many of whom you've heard from already, who are going to be looking for those opportunities as well. I'm sure that everybody's getting sick of me going on a little monologue here. So I'm going to press pause, if that's okay, and see if there are any questions, because I would much rather address some of the specific concerns that you all have, or specific questions that you have. So I'll do that now if there are any questions.
Sure. Well, thank you. That was a great overview. And I know you have to know a lot about a lot right now. So
Yeah.
I think you could talk probably for an hour and a half and still have a lot of issues to discuss. So
Sure, absolutely.
yeah, so we appreciate your detailed overview of everything. So there were a couple of questions have been generated. And one, I'm going to kind of kick this one off first because you most recently spoke about it, the Grow Texas Fund concept. I did get a message from Sally with Galveston County talking about that the city of Galveston itself has no taxing authority. So to be competitive for funding, eligibility couldn't be necessarily limited to navigation districts or port authorities.
Right.
And so I didn't know if you had a comment to that restriction, and if there was any.
So, well, and we are in the process of revamping all of this. So just because this legislation was proposed in a certain way during the last session doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly the same in the upcoming session. We're certainly looking for ways to improve that, and obviously this will work best when it has the broadest applicability. So yeah, we are absolutely looking at ways, and by the way, it's not just for port authorities or navigation districts. Other counties would be eligible just for other, highway projects as well. So I think for the example of Galveston County, that there would be a really good opportunity there, even without a port authority or a navigation district, just for, even if it's just improvements to Interstate 45 in Galveston County, or some other state highways, that would be an option for them.
Well, and I apologize. Perhaps I didn't represent that correctly. So the way that the structure is the Port of Galveston the port has no taxing authority, and then the Port of Galveston is a utility of the city, and so that's where that restriction kind of falls.
I see.
So, so it sounds as if maybe more of a conversation with you, and maybe Representative Oliverson and Perez, to others that would be co-authoring something again with you on that issue would probably be helpful. So just
yes, no, and I think that would be a good way to move forward. But just to provide some level of comfort, based on the way that this was proposed last time, even if that, so this would not require a new tax to be levied. It would be taken from existing oil and gas severance tax, which is a production tax revenue. So it would and could be granted under this fund to the Port of Galveston, even if they don't have taxing authority in their own right.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that's super helpful, and thank you, Sally, for kind of asking those questions, because these are the things where we can clear something up right now.
Right.
That's great, right? That's great. That's where we're going to take care of some things. So I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about safety. That's been a huge theme in all of these conversations. And Jay Crosley with Farm City was, he's my policy wonk on all of these sessions, because he can pull out the bill number real fast. And he says that you voted for HB 1287, which was Representative Celia Israel's Safe Neighborhood Streets bill. It passed the House Committee last session, House Committee on Transportation last session. It would change the speed limit on residential streets from 30 to 25 miles per hour. And so the question is, is this something that we can kind of get through or start tackling early in the session, in the upcoming session. There's another issue. There's a similar question raised. Our Deputy Director of Public Works is on with city streets. That's also an issue. So, you know, kind of reducing that speed limit. It's the difference between an injury and a fatality for many areas. So just thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. And I can say this, and I'm sure Representative Israel will have a few more thoughts to share about it when she speaks with you here in the coming days. But she was very passionate about that, and I haven't spoken specifically with Celia about her plans to reintroduce that legislation, but I know it's very important to her district there in the Austin area, but it's very important to so many other members as well. And so I suspect that there will be quite a bit of momentum for that moving forward into the next session. But I don't want to rain on her parade or steal her thunder, so I'll let her share that with you. But I suspect, well, let me just say this. I know this from experience. Sometimes when you are presenting legislation in the Texas House of Representatives, no matter how passionate you are about it, and really no matter how good of an idea it is, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 sessions to get it across the finish line. But we have tenacious legislators who just stick with it from one session to the next until you get the job done. And I suspect that that's the situation that this bill is in too.
Right. And I know one of the interim charges for House Transportation involves studying, you know, safety and finding ways to help reach TxDOT's goal of ending traffic deaths statewide. So this kind of ties into that conversation. And, you know, I know that the interim charges were released and people submitted comments and responses and letters on different varying pieces of it. So kind of what does that timeline look like for looking at the safety conversation and kind of studying some of the feedback? We know that that's going to have to be a topic. We don't know what's going to come out of it, but in your kind of viewpoint, what do you think? How do you think that that's going to flow, that timeline for those conversations? And related to the interim charges, how much are you guys going to speak before session?
Well, and this is one of those items that has been it's been one of the real tragedies, one of many tragedies that have resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic, in that, you know, we were in the midst of really getting into the meat of some of these conversations, and just as interim hearings were really beginning to continue with some gusto, we basically had to press pause on so many of those public hearings. That being said, I have participated virtually in most of the Texas Transportation Commission's meetings that they've had on a monthly basis throughout the year. And I know Commissioner Laura Ryan, she and I have been working together very closely on some of these issues. And of course, she's a proud daughter of Houston. And this is the safety aspect is an issue that's near and dear to her heart. She's become a champion for the cause of getting us to 0 fatalities on Texas highways. And she's really become synonymous with that cause and with that issue on the Texas Transportation Commission. So I guess this is really there are 2 answers to this issue. One is I'm afraid that the hearings that we were expecting to have going into the legislative session are not going to take place, especially now that we're just a few months away. But the cause marches on, so to speak. And I know in talking with so many of the staff at the Texas Department of Transportation, that safety continues to be a priority. And look, we just, the fact of the matter is we have too many fatalities on Texas highways, and we are working very diligently to reduce that number. And I think that we have reduced that number, but for so many of the mechanisms that have been put in place, but for the culture of safety that has really enveloped TxDOT, I think that the fatality numbers would be much worse than they are. That being said, there's still so much work that needs to be done, and we're utilizing technological improvements, emerging technologies, and quite frankly, just better data to help make that happen. The fact of the matter is, and unfortunately Commissioner Ryan can expand on this too, this is such a big problem that that has so many different causes, so many different sources, and it exists on absolutely on a statewide basis. Uh, it's not something that we're going to be able to make go away overnight, but it's something that we do have to continue working on. And I think it has to be a part of everything that we do. When we're building infrastructure projects, we have to design them and build them with safety in mind, with designing them in such a way that prevents fatalities. We have been doing that, and we just have to continue to do that. And as more tools emerge, what's working well in other states, I think that we have to incorporate that into what we're doing at the state level here in Texas.
Okay, thank you. I know that one of the surprises about COVID was that we thought that that number would drop more significantly, the daily fatality rate. And one of the indicators was speed. It didn't matter the amount, right? It was still speed was a huge factor. So, I think I and I think others are looking forward to more data like that helps tell a story and helps guide some policy. And like you said, it's not a one shot fix, right? There's a lot of different things we can do to tackle the safety issue. I want to talk about alternatively fueled vehicles, and it's a hot issue. It started creeping out last session. We actually supported one of the bills that Representative Mondo Martinez put in to the House Transportation Committee, and then a few others trickled out too. Then there was a study commissioned that should be released. I think the findings will be released in December, looking at the actual amount of people that are driving alternatively fueled and electric vehicles around the state. Our conversation with Senator Hancock was interesting. His view was that while he acknowledges that there needs to be something done with assessing fees for kind of an equity conversation, he felt that it's tied to a much larger issue where we need to look at how we even collect revenue, period, for funding transportation. So kind of gas tax conversations. And he didn't quote it as vehicle miles traveled, but that was essentially what he was saying. So I'm curious how you feel, whether or not you think that's something that we need to look at sooner than later in its own box, right? Making sure that people are paying, or it needs to put a hold on that and then wait and look at it in a much broader sense.
No, I think it's something that we do need to begin addressing or continue addressing it. And you're right, Mondo had a bill that received quite a bit of discussion and quite a bit of testimony in the Transportation Committee during the 2019 session. Let me just share my view on this particular subject. I guess the bottom line is, the way I would describe my position is that everyone needs to pay their fair share in order for us to maintain the state's transportation system. So if you drive on public roads that, and that has the impact of degrading, at least to some degree, the roads, then that use needs to, everybody needs to pay their fair share to help maintain them. So, as far as the policy direction that takes, the state needs to have a solution for the growing alternative fuel market, or the AFV market, and as that market continues to grow, that just has to be accounted for. So I think Senator Hancock probably, I think he does have a very good point that, maybe that balance, it's not just a handful of AFVs that are on the road. It's an increasingly large number, and instead of just treating them like they're the exception to the rule, maybe we just need to have a new rule that takes everything into account a little bit better than just trying to make modifications to the old way of doing things. But the bottom line is that everybody needs to pay in, everybody needs to pay their fair share for that use. Otherwise, we're just getting into an unjust situation where certain vehicle operators are subsidizing others just by virtue of the type of vehicle that they're driving, even though they're all having a similar impact on the condition of the roadways.
Right. So to kind of continue that conversation, we have a large agenda. I often call it the kitchen sink agenda, right? It's all
right
there since we started, really intentionally looking at transportation funding and policies, but we try to tier our priorities. And so our top three do include a conversation about alternative fuel vehicles. The other one is we've said, while we understand that it's not going to be wildly popular to increase the gas tax, can we at least look at indexing it to inflation? We have a conversation about that because it also elevates education funding at the same time,
Right.
not by leaps and bounds, not maybe what's actually needed for education in its entirety, but it certainly, isn't chump change. I think I have 935.8 million was raised for schools in 2019 as a result of collection of the gas tax. So just thoughts on that. And we know increasing taxes is not a politically popular thing. But do you think that there's any traction with kind of talking about indexing?
Well, I believe so. That's obviously the smarter policy, and just a quick joke along those lines. So one of my old mentors who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago here in Odessa is a guy named Ray Stoker, and Ray served two different terms on the first on the Texas Highway Commission and then on the Texas Transportation Commission, and he was on the commission when our current fuel tax was adopted. And from the time I was elected to the legislature until the day he died, I would always jokingly, but somewhat seriously criticize him and his fellow commissioners at that time for not indexing this tax for inflation, because the aversion to raising that tax has just allowed it to remain stagnant. And so that source of revenue has been flatlined somewhat, while other costs just continue to rise with inflation and for other reasons. And so by the way, he had a good explanation for doing it. So I don't want to put too much blame on them, for a decision that was made 30 years ago. But whenever this is finally addressed, and of course there are going to be quite a few political considerations that go into doing that, and that day may be here sooner than many people imagined. But when that day does come, and when the motor vehicle, or when the fuel tax is addressed, I think we absolutely have to make sure that it's indexed. That way, it's somewhat self-regulating, and we don't get into a situation where it's just been a third rail that nobody's wanted to touch for 3 decades.
Right. Agreed. Yeah. And I think people do forget that there is a 25 cents on the dollar, right? It's a percentage of it that goes to education. Right. It
yes.
helps
No. Right. No. And that's a good point. I mean, in 2018 alone, the state motor fuels tax, not only put almost 3.8 billion into the state highway fund, but it was also just shy of $1 billion for public schools, and specifically for their transportation needs. But that's a big expense when you're looking at public education funding. And so it is important, and that does need to be accounted for, and that will absolutely have to be part of the conversation, because it is a tax that doesn't just benefit highways, it also benefits one of the quite honestly, at least from my perspective and from the people who I serve in West Texas, those are really the two most important investments that the state of Texas makes, are into our public schools and into our highways. So, there's definitely an argument there, but we do have to make sure that everybody understands that's what's at stake.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Another big theme that will pop up again is the kind of local control conversations. So there's a lot that falls into that bucket, whether you're talking about property tax issues, or you're talking about localities asking for the, kind of the power to tax themselves. And so one of the things that TAG has looked at, we feel it's an economic development conversation especially for localities, is, we are capped with the sales tax at 8.25. And we would need that state enabling legislation even to have just the ability to ask our residents or citizens to say yes to a tax increase to fund, if it's transportation, it could be specific projects, any kind of infrastructure. Or certainly it could even be split between other issues that we need locally. But we don't even have the ability to do that if we wanted to, unless we get the state to approve it. And I say that because we talk about, how much money the gas tax put into the state transportation fund, and it's in the billions, right? And so we look at the numbers for raising that cap on the sales tax. It was just a penny for kind of our region. Annually, we're talking about, over $1 billion. So that is, or very close to it. And then you look at the numbers that for every about $1 billion that you invest in transportation, you generate about 13,000 jobs. And for every dollar that you invest in transportation, your return on investment can range anywhere from about $3 to $6, on that dollar. So
right.
We feel it's an economic development and vitality conversation. It is also a tax conversation, unfortunately. And then it's also a local control conversation. So I'm curious kind of how you think some of that can be part of a conversation where we're not talking about it in a way that it's a tax increase, but that it's actually looking at job creation and recovery, as we move forward. And maybe it's not even just this, it's not even just that tax conversation, but how do we frame those discussions so that people understand that when we're investing in transportation, we're actually looking to recover the economy and enhance it and sustain it.
Well, you're right. I think it is, especially when you're talking about transportation infrastructure. You are talking about making an investment that invariably, if that money is spent in a smart way, which it is in almost every case in Texas, that you get a return on that investment. And so I think that is an important way to frame the conversation. But I guess more broadly, since you raised this as a local control issue, I think that really is the conversation more so than a tax conversation, although there is certainly that component to it. And I'll just say this, broadly speaking, without getting into too many of the details about how this is transpired in the legislature, particularly over the last couple of sessions, I do think that we have seen the peak of the state of Texas trying to meddle in decisions that have historically been left to local entities to make. And I think, first of all, there were just some political fights that were going on between different personalities that I think amplified that. And that really did come to a head, if not in 2017, then in 2019. But I think also the way that communities have had to deal with the pandemic has really underscored the importance and the need for local problems and local issues to be met with local solutions. And I think there are many of us in the legislature who have seen the wisdom in allowing some of those decisions to be made at the local level, and nobody understands that better than somebody like me who, represents a rural part of the state that's, a 9 or 10 hour drive away from Houston. And I know that Houston has a certain set of issues that need to be addressed. And I know that the people who I serve in our communities have different needs that have to be addressed, and really having the same solution for both of those communities is it really doesn't make sense to always take that approach. And so I think that there will be a renaissance of local control coming out of Austin, and at least that's my hope. I mean, there are certain decisions that need to be made at the state level, but unless there's a specific reason for doing so at the state level, I think that we need to do everything that we can to allow local government entities to make the decisions that are best for their jurisdictions. And I really do believe that will be on the rise. And I think you'll see quite a bit of evidence that beginning in January of 2021 when the legislature reconvenes.
Right, agreed. So I appreciate that, and I think that that's good. I think some of the COVID things too ignited or shined another light on some of the local state conversations. So I think that will help, or that will certainly add to the conversation as we go into session. People are going to have lots of feelings about all of that as well.
Right.
Yes, lots of opinions. So I I think when you were talking about, so one of the other things is, right, we want to look for new streams of funding, make sure that the funding that we're using is relevant, sustainable, adequate. But we also, you mentioned having all the tools in the toolbox.
Mhm.
And I heard you talk about how you do feel that tolling is something that, if used properly, right, is a tool that we should carry in that toolbox. Um,
Mhm.
and so I'm hopeful that that again those conversations are tempered a bit as we go into session, and we can start to look at what. And I don't want to say that's a local control conversation, but the tolling systems around the state are not the same for every area, for every region,
Right.
and so
Right.
that kind of ties into that a little bit too. That conversation, where it's not a one size fits all situation. So with that, I also want to talk about TxDOT's formula for funding transportation. It's been something
Mhm.
that people have kind of talked about. It's working, really well for some areas. Other areas would say, "Oh gosh, I wish that we could do more. We could have more for transit or more for other types of projects that we need." And others say, "No, no, that needs to be its own separate kind of pot of money." And I want to say too that transit for people means something very different depending on where you live. So
Sure.
I
Sure.
put as, urban, it's kind of that heavier transit. It's the BRTs, it's the buses, it's the rail to, rails on road type transit. In more rural areas, perhaps in some of the areas that you're representing, we're talking about kind of senior transit and
Mhm.
the ability, and kind of it's more of an access conversation for older citizens.
Right.
So looking at all of that, do you feel that as we move forward, while we're looking at how we finance transportation and whether or not that needs to be changed, do you think that there's also a conversation that needs to happen on kind of the formula, or is it we need to find a different funding stream altogether
Well,
for other things?
so it's absolutely a good question. As far as that relates to the funding formula, as you know, and and quite frankly, I was very shocked to find it when I really started looking into this shortly after I was or made the decision to run for office for the legislature. But looking at that text dot funding formula, I guess I never appreciated until I really took a deep dive into it how complex it is.
Right.
And when you have a formula that is that complex, I'm reluctant to criticize it based on its complexity because when you do that deep dive and you look down and see how it accounts for so many of these different pots of money that go for different mobility projects, and as you indicated, that does mean different things to so many different people depending on your season in life, depending on your geographic location. Uh, I'm reluctant to criticize that, but if it is going to be complex in the way that it is, we have to constantly and on a regular basis update that formula to make sure that it continues to address the needs that it was designed to address. Because when you do have something that's that complex, it can become stale very quickly if it's not consistently and constantly being updated and rejuvenated. And so I think that's the biggest challenge that we is making sure that it is actually meeting the needs of the people of Texas as close to a real-time basis as possible. And then the second part to that is when you're looking at different revenue streams. Uh, Obviously, the more revenue that can be earmarked or allocated for these projects is helpful. So I guess I'm not completely opposed to the status quo, but the three things that I want to do with the status quo, as far as the formula is concerned, is yes, let's get more money in there to fund it or to be distributed under the formula. B, let's make sure that it's constantly updated to address the actual needs of the state. And then three is to make sure that the data that are used in those calculations are accurate. We want to make sure that we're actually gathering the appropriate data and making sure that uh, decisions are based on reality instead of anything that could be error prone. And so I think as long as we do those three things, then we can make the framework for the current funding formula continue to work. But that does take some shepherding, as you might imagine.
Right. And I appreciate your kind of applaud of the complexities of the budget. And we have got several tech stock folks on, and so it is. I mean, it's a well-oiled, machine of people, and it's a dedicated group of people that really do a lot for the state of Texas. So thank you for mentioning that, and I appreciate also the conversation about let's just keep looking and making sure that we're staying kind of where we need to be for the state with regards to those formulas. And that also lends itself to the question is, at what point do we need to go back and look and see what is kind of that new gap that we have that we need to fund for the state highway fund? We did the 2030 commission. Those numbers have obviously changed.
Right.
And there's also been discussions about, is it time to do another type of kind of commission like that, so we can get a really good handle on what is that gap that we need to fill over the next 20 to 25 years. So we hope that that's something also that the legislature will consider and will look at, because the data is what drives good policy.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to pause from transportation and just ask a general kind of state of the session as you see it going forward, how you think it's going to feel with the veil of COVID. What are some of obviously the challenges of perhaps not being face-to-face or being face-to-face with such a limited structure, and then other issues that you think we need to be thinking about and mindful of, so we're not just kind of siloed in our own transportation conversation, which is easy to do and fun to talk about for us advocates and experts, but
Sure. Well, no, those are great questions, and of course, so many of the conversations among legislators and those who are engaged in the process, I mean, that's precisely what's being talked about all across the state of Texas right now. I've devoted quite a bit of thought to it and had many conversations about it. The way that I see it, and there are so many things to take into consideration here, but the legislative process is one that really only works and is only supposed to work with the involvement of the people. And so, that's one concern is, how do you make that happen in a safe way? I think we have to do it in a safe way, but we have to do whatever it takes to safely involve the input of the governed rather than just the safety of those who are doing the governing. And so this has to be a public process. It has to be a transparent process. I mean, first of all, I think you get better outcomes that way with more public involvement, and there's more accountability with public involvement. But then also just transparency for transparency's sake. Also, I think that builds up more confidence in the process. And so whatever work we have to show for our time in the legislative session, if it's viewed with too much skepticism by the people of Texas, then I think that makes it a little bit more difficult for that work to be effective. So I guess the bottom line there is, and who knows how things are going to look in January, just because this is such a moving target. But however the situation looks in January and the succeeding months, whatever work the legislature does on behalf of the people of Texas needs to intimately involve the people of Texas. As far as other issues, I'm sure the comptroller mentioned this when he was visiting with you a few weeks ago, but we are going to be in a very desperate budget situation. Certainly, this will be the most challenging revenue situation that I've seen since I have been in the Texas House of Representatives, and it's going to be that way for a vast majority of state representatives. And that's, I guess, thanks in large part to the economic prosperity that we've experienced as a state in recent years. So it's no doubt going to be challenging. I think that the budget situation will, uh, be the elephant in the room that, of course, we'll begin to address almost immediately. But that is going to be the top issue, and then of course all of the sub issues that fall behind that. Things like how do we make sure that we continue to prioritize public education funding and transportation funding under the constraints of a much smaller budget than we've been accustomed to dealing with in recent sessions. And so, the bottom line is there are going to be some very difficult decisions that have to be made. Some priorities are going to be tested, and so that's going to be very challenging to do. But that's what's going to guide the conversation on everything else. Unless, of course, you want to throw on redistricting and some of the other things that will be that will dominate. But I think the lack of revenue coming into the state's coffers is going to be point A1 as far as everything else is concerned.
Right, right. And I think one of the things too we talked about with everybody, but specifically most recently with Senator Hancock, was the diversion of funds.
Mm-hmm.
That's a concern. He felt confident that was not going to happen with the State Highway Fund and transportation. That was, kind of everybody was understanding that was something that is not ideal,
Right.
especially as it relates to it being kind of an investment into the economy and the return on the investment and jobs. But obviously there has been some chatter about it. So,
Sure.
But we worked really hard to end a lot of diversions with transportation a couple of sessions ago. So,
Right.
we're
Well,
hopeful.
and along those lines, I would be, and I know we're short on time, but I mean, diversion is something that always needs to be at least a concern and needs to be accounted for. And I would be opposed to that. But I guess a more immediate concern that I have is whether or not we're going to have enough revenue to reach the sufficient balance on some of the other, when you're thinking of Prop 1 or Prop 7
Right.
or the rainy day fund, are we going to reach enough revenue where the state highway fund distributions are even authorized under law? And of course, the comptroller would have a much better idea about that, and we'll have a much better picture when he comes out with his budget revenue estimate later this year. But that's a more pressing concern as far as I'm concerned.
Right. And as I understand it, as we've kind of heard in some of these conversations, it's not so much this session as it is next session that you would see.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
You would see that. And so, right. So there's things that we would need to think about now for then, but for the holding pattern that
Right.
right now.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for your time today, and for all taking some tough questions. Hopefully they weren't all too difficult, but these are tough issues. These are tough conversations to have amidst such a lot of uncertainty. So we always say it's going to be a strange session, and I think this one might actually be.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, we mean it this time.
Yes, we really do. So we appreciate your leadership. I know that every time I've seen you speak before the commission, I've always been super impressed with your passion and your knowledge for transportation. So we really appreciate that. And we wish you and your family health and safety, and great luck as we walk towards the session, and whatever that has to look like. And we look forward to more conversations with you as we get closer.
Well, I look forward to it as well. And thank you again for the invitation. It was an honor to be with you, and hope everybody out there stays safe and happy, and we'll all continue to work together.
Great. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you next week.